It's Mo. Oh my gosh. It is June 12th, so I'm a little behind in getting to the first book that I read in June, but the first book that I read in June is The Book of Tea by Okakura Kakuzō. This is a history, philosophy, instructional manual on tea. This book was written in 1906, and it has a lot to do with Eastern philosophy, the Eastern look at tea, and how tea-growing countries view tea as not only a wonderful morning or evening beverage, but a cultural phenomenon. This has a lot of the philosophical side of making tea and how people are said to have tea in them if they are a wild, carefree soul. They might have too much tea. If they are low energy, unimaginative, they might have no tea. Also on how to grow tea, brew tea, the tea ceremonies in various places, the tea ceremony in specifically Japan, and some of the philosophy behind those ceremonies and ideas. It also spoke a lot about colonialism and how Western cultures appropriated tea and how they love tea, but they don't understand Eastern cultures. So that was an interesting thing to think about as well. Comparisons that we could make to tea today. I read this for the 1900 to 1950 readathon, which you can find listed below. This book I think I finished on the second day of June, and I'm in the middle of a lot of other books right now. I'm hoping that I will finish some soon because it is almost mid-June. It's not turning out to be a wonderful reading month, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be great. So I hope that I will see you soon when I read some more. It is June 14th, and I have finished another book in June. I finished Death Comes to Pemberley. Death Comes to Pemberley is P.D. James' continuation murder mystery wrap-up of the events of Pride and Prejudice. So I have never read Pride and Prejudice. I'm sure I've seen the movie or the show of Pride and Prejudice before, but I do not remember it. It probably would have helped me to watch one of those before I read this book, because I was very confused throughout most of this book. Well, not most of it, but through parts of it. The first part of this book is kind of retelling what happened in Pride and Prejudice, and it has a lot of siblings, and it has a lot of people that have the same name, and it has a lot of people who are falling in love with people who aren't in love with them, or falling out of love with people, or finding love with people who then do love them. It was very confusing. And then the story goes on to tell of Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, who are now married, have several children, and are very happy and settled in their life at Pemberley. They are getting ready for the St. Anne's Ball. I think it's called the St. Anne's Ball, and this is a yearly event. It's a huge event. It takes up a lot of their time. It brings them a lot of joy. It gathers family and friends together, and on the eve of this ball, a few strange things start happening. Some people that they know really well are confiding in them, and suddenly a coach arrives with Elizabeth's estranged sister Lydia, who is not welcome at Pemberley. She is completely distraught, and it turns out that her husband, who once tried to seduce Darcy's sister and who the Darcys have cut all ties with, has become lost in the wood with a good friend of him, Mr. Denny. I don't want to say too much more about that because there's moments where you don't know what's happening, and so if you're familiar with those characters, I'm sure they're much more shocking and interesting than they were to me. To me, it was just the next part of the book. But if you know Mr. Wickham, and you know Lydia, and you know Georgiana, and you know the whole story, then it might be more shocking. Needless to say, there is a murder that occurs, and Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are left to help figure out the murder a little bit, but more than that, deal with the repercussions of a murder on their property. So the book kind of takes place in several sections. The first section is them getting ready for the ball. The second section is dealing with the murder and the investigation of the murder. The third section is the court trial that later occurs. I think it was very interesting to see P.D. James write emulating someone else's style. And I would guess, having never read a Jane Austen novel, that she was doing a good job. There was a lot of things which I found to be very un-P.D. James-like. There was a lot of repetition of words and phrases. There was a lot of going over the same thing again and again. There was a lot of usage of the same names over and over again. And I think that this all stemmed from trying to write like a different author. Personally, I was waiting for those signature P.D. James moments. I was waiting for the familiar plot devices that she uses. I figured she would just kind of put those devices into this retelling / continuation, but it didn't ever really solidify that way. I mean, there were some. It wasn't uninteresting, it was interesting, but it did remain confusing to me for most of it. There was a lot of the formality of the time period, which was set in 1803 to 1804. Although it was interesting to read, and I think gave me some insight into what those classics are written like, it did not make me want to read those classics. And it did not make me want to read books like those classics. It took me about 10 days to get through, which is a very long time. And it definitely did not put me in a reading slump, but it definitely, like, I freaking can't wait to read something else. Like, I'm sick of this book. I will see you when I read some more in June. It is June 23rd, and I have finished another book in June, Sula by Toni Morrison. This is the first Toni Morrison book I've ever read, and I loved it. It was amazing. What a brilliant and poetic, visionary, visual writer she is. How amazing she conjures images and feelings in her writing to you, the reader. So Sula is about two young girls who grow up in Medallion, Ohio, and they live in the bottom, which is at the top of a hill, and it is where the black people have kind of been forced to live in this town because it's less desirable than the rest of the sections of town. Sula and Nell don't find each other until they're a little bit older, but when they do, they become essentially two halves of one person. They complete each other, they think each other's thoughts, they definitely are inseparable and sometimes indistinguishable to the townfolk. When Nell gets married to a local man, Sula moves away and goes to college and has adventures away from Medallion. Over 10 years later, she comes back, and the relationship between Nell and Sula has changed dramatically. Nell is part of the town, she's part of the community, and Sula is an outsider and a troublemaker. This has to do with the girls' relationships, this has to do with their relationships with other people, this has to do with their relationships with the men in their lives and their families. It's definitely a coming of age story for both girls under different circumstances, kind of the living, breathing entity that is a community and that is a town is involved in this story, and I really loved it. Like I said, I've never read any Toni Morrison before. Her writing was just incredibly evocative, beautifully visual. One of the things that I found really interesting about this book was the way that Toni Morrison writes about the people and how she writes the people. So the people of Medallion speak very plainly, very quietly, very succinctly, very small, but the way that the town is written is huge. Like these vast pictorial descriptions of the town and of the feelings and the emotions and all those things that the townspeople are feeling. But when the townspeople talk to each other, they're like, "Hey girl, what's good?" And you're just like, what? Their inner lives and inner emotions and inner feelings and the way that they view the town is channeled so poetically in the prose, whereas in the dialogue, it's very... I'm trying to think of another word for small. It's not small, but it's so simple. It's so plain. So it's just a really interesting idea, and that she creates these two sides of each person, the dynamic of them inside and the dynamic about them outside. There's tons of reasons to read this book. I have heard that Sula is one of her least favorite novels of the people who really love Toni Morrison. I know that Gabriel from Gabriel's Books loves Toni Morrison, and I think he's read almost all of her works, and this one was one of his least favorites. I think having read it as my first Toni Morrison was great. It was a great introduction. It's very small. This was the first ever buddy read that I've done, thanks to BookTube and thanks to MH Books. Maria and I read this book over 3 weeks, and it was really fun to buddy read with her and hear her thoughts and have someone to closely discuss a book that I'm reading at the same time that I've read it with. So usually what happens is I read a book and then I have someone else read it afterwards, and then we talk about it a little bit. Or maybe I've read a book a long time ago and then someone's reading it so we get to discuss it. Or maybe the opposite, like last year I read Crying Up Lot 49 and my husband had read that a long time ago, so we were able to discuss it. I've never been in a book club where we all read the same book, so like my first buddy read was the first time that I got to discuss like real time as we were reading what the book was about and what we thought of the book. So that was really interesting, and I'm super glad to do it. I would love to do more buddy reads in the future if anyone is interested. I will say that I do think I missed some of the larger points of this book. I think that some of the resolution of this book probably went over my head, and I think that there are probably greater themes that maybe I would have to look into or I would have to reread to fully understand within this book. That being said, I loved it, and I'll see you when I read some more. It is June 25th, and I finished another book in June. I finished Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl, a memoir by Carrie Brownstein. This is a memoir of Carrie Brownstein, who is an artist and performer in Sleater-Kinney. She is a singer, guitarist, songwriter, and that was a punk band, punk riot girl, alternative indie band from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. She's also known for being a comedian and creator of Portlandia, which is a comedy sketch show that she does with other musicians. I didn't read the flap, I didn't read anything, I just got it from my friend Noah, and I knew I wanted to read it. I like Sleater-Kinney. I've known people who really, really love Sleater-Kinney, and Carrie Brownstein is an interesting person, so I was interested to learn more about her life. In the beginning of this memoir, it's very much about her childhood, her parents, her life growing up, and how she dealt with things that happened in her family. Her mother left the family after a long illness. Her father later in life came out as queer. She is queer, and I thought it was an interesting book to read for Pride Month. I expected this memoir to be more about her life, more about her feelings, and more about her personal take on everything that happened to her through her life. And of course it was, but the majority of this book is about Sleater-Kinney and about her relationship with Sleater-Kinney and how Sleater-Kinney came into be, analyzing kind of each one of their albums that came out, how it was made, what happened with it, the tours they went on, and life on the road, all sorts of other music-related memoir items. Now, I love music memoirs. I love books about music. I love to hear about albums being created, how that worked, what the process is, how they were received, what the feelings of the artist were during those times. But that's not what I expected from this, especially because the very beginning part where she talks about her early childhood and her life is much more dealing with her own emotions and her growing up. And I feel like although the parts about the band were that for her, there was a lot of stuff that was left out. There was a lot of holes and gaps. There was not much about her relationships. There was not much about her life outside the band. There was not a... It's written about how her anxiety kind of came to be the end of the band in the mid-2000s and how her relationship with the band members brought them back in the late 2010s. There was just parts of it that were missing. Like, you were getting only one side of the story And that was the story of the band, not really the story of her and her reaction to the band in a lot of ways. So I liked this book. I thought it was interesting. I'm definitely glad that I read it. It's very short, only 241 pages. But I thought this was going to be more about her than the band, and really it's more of a memoir about the band. So if you are interested in that, I definitely suggest checking it out. And I will catch up with you when I read some more in June. It is June 29th, and I have finished one more book in June. I have finished An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This was on my 20 books I found out about in 2020 that I want to read in 2021. I am slowly making my way through that list, and at the end of the year, we'll go through that list and do a little reaction to how many of those books I've read in 2021. This book is on my list because I thought it was a sci-fi adventure about a bunch of robots or statues that suddenly appear in cities all over the United States and all over the world. A young woman, her name is April May, is the first person to interact on social media with one of these statues, which she calls Carl. From her interaction being the first one with the Carls, her star kind of blows up and she finds herself at the center of this international mystery. This book was much more about April May, much more about social media, much more about the responsibility that you have on social media and the personas that you take on, both fake and real, in social media or in media in general than it was about sci-fi. There are definitely some sci-fi elements in this, but I think if I had known going into this that it was a book about reality stars, we'll call them, reality stars being like Instagrammers, vloggers, pundits, all that kind of thing, and not about the sci-fi elements, would I have felt better about this book? I don't know. I think it is important to note, though. So if you're thinking of reading this book, let it be known that this book is not really a sci-fi book as much as it is a social media book and a social commentary book. I enjoyed my time with this book. That is what I'm going to say about it. I liked it. I liked the puzzles that need to get solved. I liked the dynamic of some of the characters. I liked the social commentary look on social media and the responsibilities of social media. I like the idea that there are two sides to every story and that there are going to be extremists on every side. I like the idea that even if you think you're doing right, you might be pushing people to do wrong. And I also like the idea that when something happens to us as a global community, there are several ways to look at it. There is a positive way to look at it and to come together as a global community, and there is a negative way to look at it that is fear-driven. So I think all those things that I just mentioned are topics in this book that are explored and that I enjoyed. I think some topics in this book that are not explored have a lot to do with white privilege, have a lot to do with beauty standards, have a lot to do with taking people for granted. I think that the issues that I had with this book are not that it's not what it says on the tin, but it was written by a man and it is from a female perspective. I think it is not accurate to a female perspective. I think a lot of the things that our main character, April May, does in this book, no real woman, especially no real woman who lived in New York for several years, would ever do or put themselves in that position. And I think that comes from a place of a white male privilege writing for a female character. There are things that our main character does that I'm sure Hank Green would not bat an eye to do, but no woman who had to live on her own in New York City would ever do. I think that comes from a place of not understanding how dangerous it is to be a woman living in the city. I think it comes from not understanding how dangerous it is to be a woman. I definitely thought that there was a lot of issues with this book that were not addressed, that were there and that were obvious but were not addressed, and I think that was because Hank Green is a man. No offense to men. But while this was a fast and fun book for the most part. I think there were a lot of issues with this book that weren't talked about and weren't resolved, and I haven't seen a lot of other booktubers talk about, so I would love, if you've read this book, to discuss it in the comments below and let me know what your take on some of the things that I've said are. I'm hoping that the sequel will have more of the sci-fi elements that I enjoyed in this book and less of that kind of privileged look at fame. I will catch up with you if I read anything else in June. It is early July, and I was hoping to finish one more book in June. I am this close to finishing another book, but it is already July, so I'm not going to make it. So I'm going to talk about the 5 books that I read in June. 5 books is definitely my lowest one so far for how many books I've read. I think the thing that bogged me down a little bit this month was that I kind of did set like a summer TBR, and that I was trying to get to books of a specific like style and ilk. So in the beginning of the month I read the Book of Tea, which was finishing up my 1900 to 1950s readathon. So that was something that I had already put kind of on a TBR and that I wanted to get to. And then I was buddy reading Sula with Maria from MH Books, which was a wonderful experience, and I'm so glad I did, but it meant that I had to read this book at a very specific pace. I read Death Comes to Pemberley, and I didn't really like this book. It was based on a classic novel and written in a classical style, and I'm not really interested in reading these kind of books, so this one definitely took me a little while to get through as well. I mean, I read a lot of interesting things, a lot of different things, very wide range of things this month. I read, you know, a historical fiction, which I basically never read. It also happens to be a mystery. It's based on Pride and Prejudice. I read a couple of nonfictions. It's written by a Japanese man, and then a look at a band and fame by a white American author. I guess Sula could be considered a historical fiction as well, because it does take place earlier than it was written. It was written in the 80s, and it takes place in the kind of 20s, 30s, and 40s. And this was a Black American author writing about a small American town and the people in it, and what happens to them when they leave the town, and what happens to them when they come back. And then I read A Absolutely Remarkable Thing, which is a contemporary novel written in 2018 about a young bisexual woman and her dealing with fame. I would say that kind of ties in with this book. I tried to read some queer books for June. Now, June is not the only month you can read queer books, but I was able to read Hunger Makes Me a Modern Girl and An Absolutely Remarkable Thing. I didn't love the representation in either of these books as far as queerness goes. Carrie Brownstein's memoir was really interesting, but I really wanted to hear more about her life growing up queer, and I really wanted to hear more about her father coming out when she was an adult, and I wanted to hear more about that experience, but that is not what this book ended up being about. Hank Green's An Absolutely Remarkable Thing features a bisexual woman, but it was not on Voices, and I felt like that was very, very clear, and I also felt that her bisexuality was shoehorned in a little bit. It being a totally natural relationship, her having a relationship with women and with men and kind of lusting after women and men would have been fine, except that it was used in the fame aspect in kind of a negative way, where as the main character gets famous, her agents want her to be gay, not bisexual, which is an interesting commentary, but then in the end, it's just used against her, just like they said it was going to be in the book, but then that subject is totally dropped and not discussed any further. So I wasn't in love with that representation either. I read from some authors of color, which is always great. It was interesting to see this historical philosophy book written in 1906 from Japan. Sula was definitely the best book by far that I read this month. I really loved this, and I loved the buddy reading experience because I was able to discuss it so well as I was reading it. Overall, a small reading month, definitely, but never a bad reading month, and as long as I read at least a book a week, I'm pretty happy. So I made it just over that this time by reading 5 books in June. hopefully my July will move on a little quicker and I will get some more books read. There are so many books from my summer TBR that I want to get to in the next month or two. There is a new booktube spin that I want to get to. There is summer hibernation coming up that I think I'm interested in. Let me know what your favorite book from June was down below. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.